Good morning and welcome to you all to the 29th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual, at this point, can I remind those present to switch off mobile phones, Blackberries and other wireless devices, as they can often interfere with the sound system. In saying that, of course, at this point I'll also make you aware that you may have noticed that some of the members and officials are using iPads and tablet devices, and this is instead of the hard copies of their paper, so we're not Googling or doing emails while you're all here. We have apologies for Richard Simpson. Malcolm Chisholm is with us as a Labour Party substitute. The first item on the agenda today is subordinate legislation, and we have one negative instrument to consider, and that is the Food Additives, Flavourings, Enzymes and Extraction Solvents Scotland Regulations 2013, SSI 2013 266. There has been no motion to annul. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has drawn the committee's attention to 2 points. Details of these are contained, as you know, in your papers. Are there any comments from the members? No comments. Sure? Okay. I will therefore put the question on SSI 2013-266 that the committee has no recommendations to make. Are we all agreed? That is agreed then, thank you. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is the annual process of scrutiny of the Scottish Government draft budget. This morning we have a round table of stakeholder organisations, and as usual I will invite guests and members to introduce themselves, although there are well-kent faces here this morning. And obviously in these type of sessions I will give priority as convener to the witnesses in speaking, and they'll have the advantage there. So my name is Duncan McNeill, MSP for Greater Inverclyde, and convener of the committee, and on my right is Iris Bozart, the committee's budget advisor. Bob?
Yeah, Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and deputy convener of the committee.
Hello, I'm Donald Harley. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the BMA in Scotland.
I'm Malcolm Chisholm, MSP for Edinburgh Northern and Leith.
Lynette Milne, MSP for North East Scotland.
Hello, I'm Annie Gunnar-Logan from the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland.
Gil Patterson, MSP for Clydebank Mulgai.
Aileen MacLeod, MSP for the South of Scotland.
Kim Hartsley, representing the Allied Health Professions Federation in Scotland.
Rhoda Grant, Highlands and Islands, MSP.
Hello, I'm Rachel Cackett. I'm a Policy Advisor for the Royal College of Nursing.
Richard Lyle, Central Region, MSP.
Matt McLaughlin from Unison, Scotland.
Mark MacDonald, MSP for Aberdeen Donside.
Thank you all for that. We move to Bob Doris to put a couple of questions and start off the session. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, convener. So looking at the budget that we have before us, and I see that there's a cash increase in the forthcoming year of £267 million, 2.9% increase, but a 1% real terms increase. I take the figures from the SPICE briefing that was prepared for this meeting. Of course, within any overall budget with an increase, there are always increases and decreases within various individual budget lines, and I'll pick out maybe just two, convener, to start to maybe allow a kind of discussion between our witnesses. I see that there's a small fall on the health improvement, health inequalities budget in the next year, although that said it is planned to go up in 15-16, but it does fall in the coming financial year, whilst we've got early detection of cancer increasing by 8.3% in real terms in the forthcoming year. So there's two budget lines, there's decisions that have been made by the government, there's a whole range of budget lines there. I'd be interested to know from witnesses whether you think the Scottish Government's got the balance just about right. I'd be particularly interested to know about the two budget lines that I've identified, but generally, do you think the balance is just about right? But more importantly, if you don't think the balance is just about right, it would be helpful for us if you could say where you would move the money from within the budget process, because we'd all like to see increases you know, as politicians and as witnesses and as partners in the field, but that money has to be sourced. So do you think the government's got the balance right in a rising budget, and where would you reprioritise if you decided to do so?
I'll get a response first, Malcolm. Thank you. Yes, please.
I think it's a really hard question to answer, and I think that the difficulty is the same difficulty we've had for a number of years, which is it's very, very hard still to put together the narrative that goes around the decisions on why budgets have been allocated as they have and why changes have been made from what we may have expected from the Comprehensive Spending Review initial plans to the budget that we have today. It was great to have the level 4 detail a little earlier this year so that we could actually go through that and have a better understanding from the government of why some decisions have been made. But it's very hard when quite a lot of the lines will say things like this budget has gone down due to efficiencies that won't affect the productivity of that particular area, without any elucidation of exactly what that meant. It's a sort of it's a bit of an issue of trust of just that's what we're told, so that's what we have to believe. I mean, I would inevitably pick up on a different line, which is the nursing line, which is the nursing education and training line, which has seen an 11 million decrease this year over what we were expecting. We do understand some of the rationale for that in the change to the one-year job guarantee. But for me, that's one area where the continued disconnect between the very good priorities I think the government has set for health and the way the budget is presented really comes to the fore. We've obviously put in our submission 2 areas where we thought that could be reinvested to meet exactly the priorities that government has put out, whether that's investing in health visitors around early prevention, which I know there's been significant cross-party support for, or whether that's looking more creatively at our integration proposals. It wasn't that long since we were sat around this table discussing that, and a demographic which is going to mean increasing needs to provide complex clinical care at home 24/7, and we have to think really creatively about how we train our workforce to do that. And on that basis, it's a bit of a shame from our point of view to see 11 million lost from the budget rather than redirected, and there isn't a way within the narrative to explain why that decision has been made. So I come back to saying it's a really hard question to answer because of the presentation of the budget, and I know we've sat around this table and said that previously.
Okay. Anyone else wish to respond to? Yes. Donald Hartley. Sorry.
Thank you. So we welcome the protection that the government's afforded to the NHS budget, but nevertheless, I think it has to be recognised there will be ongoing pressures created by health inflation, which means that progressively less is going to be able to be delivered. And I think that there needs to be a degree of honesty about that with the Scottish public, and we would hope that the politicians will be leading that public debate about what can be provided within these falling budgets. And it may be that the existing configuration of services is not the most efficient way of doing things, and maybe difficult decisions have to be looked at in terms of the way current services are configured.
Honesty, difficult decisions. Oh, Kim Hart.
From the Allied Health Professions Federation point of view, we welcome the balance towards prevention and health inequalities and that drive. I think our concerns, and in respect of the 2 budget lines that Mr. Doris mentioned, very helpful in that regard. The issue really that we would want to explore around that balance is how that money is distributed, how we're using it efficiently, and also thinking about the funds that come from these sorts of pots. How are we making sure that the best use is made of those in terms of engaging the full capacity and capability of the workforce out there? And also, once that those short-term funds have come to an end, what happens? It's the robustness of the what happens next is the issue which would be helpful for the Health Committee to consider.
Anyone else of the panel? Bob?
I think, Convener, I think that shows the problem that all of us have in terms of scrutinising budgets when it's, you know, there's not a cost-free option. If you decide to reprioritise, then we all have to say who the losers would be, if you like. But I was quite interested in Rachel Catchett's comments in relation to nursing education and training. I wonder if it's possibly a slight addition to that. I'm aware that there's a developing workforce management tool. That's the extent of my knowledge of it, Rachel, I have to admit. I know there's a developing one and also a bed management tool as well. I'm just wondering if whether you would anticipate or expect that future budget lines in relation to nursing education and training would be informed by that workforce management tool, and whether or not you think that would give you some kind of comfort and security for the future in relation to a strategic planning ahead of the nursing workforce and the budget lines that would underpin that.
There's quite a lot in there. Just to unpack some of those, there is a number of nationally agreed, and we've been supportive of the development of those, of nursing and midwifery workforce and workload planning tools. From next year, they will be mandated for boards to use. And there are issues around what that mandate means. And I know we've been quite strong in saying, you know, it's not about running a tool in one ward and then extrapolating that because that ward says that's the figure, that's what the figure should be everywhere. So there are still some ironing out things, but it's definitely a positive way forward that there is some evidence base that does include professional judgment over what the whole nursing team should look like. What those tools don't do, for example, is tell you the skill mix between unregistered and registered staff. So there's still judgment to be taken there, and of course that does come into an issue of cost sometimes, and that's our concern. It's certainly true that we would hope that workforce planning that's done in a really rigorous way would better inform our student planning process, and clearly that's a significant part of the nursing education line, which gives the students up to the point of registration. What I think we still need to work out is how we deal with the postgraduate end of training for nurses, particularly as we are going to require nurses working at very high levels of competence over the coming years. And at the moment, what we don't have is a central budget for that in the way that maybe other parts of the profession do. So a lot of that responsibility is pushed back down to board level. And then, of course, we have an issue that boards have huge amounts of pressure on them in terms of making ends meet when they have financial targets to hit and increasing health cost pressures. So I think one of the things that we should be thinking if we want a strategic approach to future nurse education is, yes, the workforce planning tools should help and they should give us a better idea of what we need. But what we don't yet have is the strategic overview of the postgraduate education to get the specialist nurses in place. And that, I think, we still need some work on.
Kim?
Can I, the line that Mr Doris referred to is the NMAP, in fact, Nursing, Midwifery and Allied Health Professions. And I think everything that Rachel's just said about nurses, of course, people need multidisciplinary teams around them, and where you secure formulas for nurses, and for the medical staff, or our colleagues in the other professions, what patients need is services for those colleagues to refer to. And so I think it's the workforce planning tool that we're looking at needs to be strategically looking at the whole team around the individual. I think in our going back to the point around how the budgets are used, it's how is the decision making made, how is the decision making done at a central level. If we've got those pots of money from central government going to health inequalities, for example, what are the conditions on that in terms of, well, what do projects have to, what are projects engaging in terms of that capacity and capability, and therefore how does it play out in terms of the multidisciplinary team to meet the outcomes that these budgets are seeking to deliver.
I'm going to take Ma McLaughlin first, Rachel, and then you.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I'd just like to back up the colleagues' comments about the education budget and answer Mr Doris's point. I mean, I think as we go forward, as we sit here, I think a lot of us in the Scottish Health Service breathe a sigh of relief around Francis and other developments south of the border. And I think as we go forward, if we're to avoid those kind of issues becoming newsworthy in a Scottish context, then I think we need to accept that education and investment in training for staff is absolutely critical and key. And by that I mean all staff, from domestics, care and assistants, right up to very, very senior clinicians. And I think, you know, sadly we know that education budgets and training budgets are quite often the first area sliced when financial pressure comes on. And I do think we need to have a bit of a rethink around that, because that is an investment in our current staffing, and it's an investment in our staffing who will come into the service, and they're absolutely key going forward.
Rachel, you want to back in?
Yeah, just I suppose one additional point, given what else the committee is doing at the moment, given who's around the table today, is to say that those tools that we have, which are very welcome, and not yet for absolutely every setting, are NHS tools. So we do also have to think of the fact that we do have a policy that is moving towards a very different way of providing services across health and social care, where nurses and AHPs and others will be located and employed by other employers who are not included in that. So we do even have an issue that it's giving us a better sense of what we might need within NHS settings. It's not yet extended beyond that to give us a sense of what we might need to be training for a much broader way of providing health services in the future.
Aye.
Thank you, Convener. Just to come in on a slightly different point. Obviously, a lot of the budget document and the resources that it discusses relate to services for people who are requiring care. And I mention this because of Bob Doris's point about health improvement. But if you go back to the Christie Commission recommendations, we also need some attention to activities which are going to keep people out of the system, people who do not currently require care, and the prevention agenda, the upstream agenda to keep them out of care. And so we've been focusing in on the specific aspects around that, such as the Change Fund. I don't know if that's going to come up in questioning later on. But a lot of that is to do with what decisions are made about budget allocation locally, rather than at national budget level. And I suppose the important part for us is what are the levers in the budget to ensure that that kind of activity will be funded and happen. And I guess we still have some doubts about that.
Donald Hanley.
Thank you. On the subject of health and social care integration and indeed change funds, to echo other colleagues, we have a concern that, about the very temporary nature of the change fund and how sustainable it will be for successor organisations once there's that time limited funding has expired. Also, to make the point that it's unlikely that there'll be a huge downshift in complex elderly admissions to secondary care, and that will still need to be resourced in much the same way. And at the same time, expectations of primary care and GPs in particular is rising, but of course that's against a backdrop of a real terms reduction of almost 2% in funding for GPs. And it's very, very difficult for GPs to meet all those expectations from within their own resources, and I think that does need a fundamental re-examination.
No, I think we should let some of my colleagues in, but that's been quite helpful, particularly around workforce planning.
I mean, I think we covered many of the areas that we need to maybe cover in a wee bit more detail. Malcolm?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already touched on integration and health inequalities, which I think are two of the things we are particularly interested in, and if I'm allowed, I might come back to them in a minute. But I suppose the prior question is, and this we've been asked to look at this by the Finance Committee, really, is to what extent the budget is linking up the targets and the indicators with budget lines. I mean, I find it personally quite confusing in health, because we've got the National Performance Framework, which you may or may not be familiar with lots of the indicators are health ones, but then we've got all the specific quality strategy and heat targets, and so I actually find the plethora of targets and indicators quite confusing. But I suppose in principle it would be a good idea to link up, to decide what are the key indicators that we're going to focus on in health, and to try and tie those to budget lines. And if those indicators are moving in the wrong direction, maybe that would be an argument for increasing that budget line. So I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that. But if that may seem a bit abstract, then perhaps health inequalities would be an illustration of that. If health inequalities is a key objective of health and indeed government more generally, and that's not, it seems, improving over a long period of time significantly, does that suggest that we should be targeting more resources at that? And as Bob Doris said at the beginning, the line's actually going down for next year. So I just wonder if we should be trying to home in on you know, specific indicators and targets and matching up the budget with those. And I suppose my last point is, you know, if you do think that about health inequalities, what can be done more effectively to deal with that problem, which seems to be a problem that's not getting any better.
Any takers? Donald Harley.
Just very briefly, we'd obviously support a role for targets, but we have a long-standing concern that there's an overexpansion of targets across the NHS. And it's a truism that you get what you measure and not what you don't. And in a time of diminishing resources, it has to be a worry that that combination of targets and low resources potentially does create some of the drivers that we saw in Francis and Mid-Staffs.
Anyone else, Annie?
Well, just to agree with the member, really, and to bring more confusion into the discussion potentially, that we're about to embark on a series of national outcomes for integration, as well as all the different measures that the member has already mentioned. Plus, we're going to have a review of the national care standards for social care. So I do think it is becoming increasingly difficult for people who have budget allocation decisions to actually match budgets up, because there is this plethora there. And colleagues have remarked occasionally in meetings that I've been in that sometimes these things work against each other. You know, as long as you've got kind of process-driven targets around waiting times and so on, then that actually inhibits your ability to free up resources for some of the decommissioning and upstream activity that I was talking about earlier. So I think some clarity around whose targets are they anyway, I guess, would be very helpful for people working in the system.
Anyone else? Kim? And Rachel, I think. And Matt. There you go. We got there.
I can't agree more that there's a plethora of in targets, outcomes, and we're forgetting as well the early years outcomes, the outcomes for children and young people as well. There's so that's the state of play. I think from the AHP Federation's perspective, in linking the budgets to those targets and indicators, we're back to that. It depends how you think, which inputs are going to deliver those outcomes, and therefore where do you put your budget? And we've not answered that question clearly, or we keep changing the answer to that question, and that's why we get this. We might not be reaching the targets because we don't have the correct mix there in order to deliver the target. We may be funding it fine. So there's lots of decisions in there to be made, but it would seem to make sense that if you're trying to achieve objective A, then the input, one of which is resources, needs to be is key in that, as is what you actually do with that financial resource, what you spend it on in order to deliver that outcome rather. And yeah, there is possibly a disconnect between the indicators or the measurement of indicators and actually what happens in budgets.
Rachel?
I think the small child next door is probably expressing the frustration that a lot of people feel at trying to make this work. I made the mistake once of trying to map the indicators that I thought our members in the health service were having to try and work through as they were deciding how to deliver services, and ended up with the most extraordinarily confusing map. And I did sit back and think, I don't know how anyone actually does this. What we should have is a tool for prioritisation. We keep coming to the committee, and I know the committee keeps saying we have to make difficult decisions and prioritise an ever limited set of funding. And without absolute clarity on what those priorities are, we tie the hands of people on the ground in service who are having to make those decisions. And I think there are two things that I would maybe add in. One is that I very much welcome the protection that health has got, but we are about to move into a very different landscape. And we ran a survey of community nurses last year, and 69% of those nurses responded saying that they felt that pressures on their team had increased because of social care cuts. And we have to keep remembering that if you cut social care and you squeeze the balloon in one place, it will come out somewhere else. And the more we integrate, the more that will be the case. And we have to think in the round about what this means with an integrated budget. The other issue, I suppose, that I haven't quite understood as yet, and we mentioned this in our written evidence, is at the moment the committee is looking at essentially two lines of allocation. One is the core funding to health boards, which they spend to create their basic service, and the other is the non-recurring specific lines which the government uses, often linked to heat targets, to help sort of pump prime some of that work. And if we're moving to a place of joint strategic commissioning where the expectation is that those priorities will be set locally depending on local need, what I haven't yet understood is how future budgets, should the Public Bodies Bill go through, will actually allow for that level of central targeting of resource rather than allowing a general pot of money to be decided to how it's spent locally. And I don't even think we've quite worked out how that's going to emerge as the budget process changes, I presume, as integration goes further down the line.
Matt?
Thanks, Convener. Just to pick up both the members' point. I mean, first in terms of the budget linked to indicators set against budget lines in this book, that book, this framework, another framework. I mean, you're right, it's absolutely torture to try and get a sense of. I think part of that's about the NHS being a big beastie, and it does a whole stack of different things, and there's a whole varied interaction with people, from very, very low-level interaction around, school nursing assistants right up to, new hearts, new lungs, all these kind of life-saving interventions. So I think we do need some measures. I think people have commented on, of course, the minute you start to create targets, you create an industry to prove that you are meeting the targets. And I think that's a major danger as we continue to go forward. I think just two quick examples around that, though. We've seen some of the challenges around Lothian in terms of the waiting list problem there, and in order to meet the target we are throwing and wasting money, putting services out to the private sector that don't need to be there, and as I understand it, the waiting list is not going down. So I think there is a massive question there in terms of efficiency and how we use services and how we are pressed to meet these targets just for the hell of meeting a target. I think there's the other thing that kind of happens in a more acute setting is that we know, for example, that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have almost permanent consultants in the board working with them to try and help them, assist them to meet the clean hospital targets. Now, you might argue that is a good thing, but you have to question in terms of efficiency and use of money why we need to buy in that resource on an almost permanent basis. And at the same time, they're faced with a fundamental challenge in terms of efficiency, that it takes over 6 weeks to get a domestic PVG checked. So you can't, but domestics only need to hand in 1 week's notice. So there are more domestics going out the system than we can ever get in the system. And as a result of that, people fail to meet targets in some of these local areas. So I think these are big things that just setting a target doesn't necessarily mean we get to the answer or the proper solution. In terms of the integrated care and health inequalities agenda, I mean, I'm sure other people have said, I think, there is a feeling that we've put the horse before the cart a wee bit on this one, and people are out doing stuff now before we've got proper bills and direction. So I think there's an issue around that if we're keen to look at inefficiency, because I think what we've got just now is a lot of people talking about process and a lot of people talking about structure, and next to nobody talking about quality outcomes. And I think the fear is that if we just start to impose more initiatives and more targets into that system, then what we will get is a cost-driven exercise rather than a quality-driven exercise. And I would hope that this Parliament and this committee are more interested in quality-driven outcomes around tackling inequality, because I think we mentioned education earlier, but we know that the investment in education is key to tackling health inequalities. And from a kind of health perspective, in terms of going forward, we absolutely need clinical and staff governance around that agenda to make sure that that quality agenda and that professional quality agenda stays part of the direction of travel. And I think that is a major risk for us at the moment.
many areas, obviously, you know, as Bob pointed out in his opening question here, we're dealing with the budget and that sort of narrow focus on all of these issues. We are currently, as you know, looking at legislation and integration and opportunities to take evidence on many of these issues, including elderly care in the past and others, and you know, made some of these comments. But today, I suppose the question, as we've had around the table here today, does the budget in itself, you know, just looking at it generally, does it support a more preventive strategy in a serious way? Does it promote what everybody says that we need? That prevention, that integration services, that delivery. Does this budget play its part in driving those priority? It seems everybody agrees with. What's significant about this budget that is different, that is making a step change to bring about those preventive strategies and a successful integration? Donald Harder.
I think it is, in many ways, moving in the right direction. That preventative care is something that I'm sure we would all aspire to. The trouble is, because you're moving within relatively fixed funds, it's a bit like a Chinese puzzle. As you move resources to one area, inevitably it's potentially leaving somewhere else weak. And we currently have a concern around unscheduled and unplanned care. And we see the unintended consequences of the very laudable time to treatment guarantees and all the rest of it against the backdrop of a system that's working at maximum capacity and with very, very high bed occupancy, oftentimes above what the design of the system is for, which has knock-on effects in terms of healthcare-acquired infections and so on and so forth. But it also means you create multiple choke points in the system, combined with the ability of the social care sector to receive people at the other end and take them out. So we have a concern that there's no flexibility in the current system to deal with urgent care, while at the same time we're dealing with long-term and planned care. And as we're moving into the winter season, which, as I'm sure committee members know, is a time when there are increased pressures on the system and spikes in demand, we have a worry that we're failing to keep pace now. And although the government has laudably put forward some funding, we're not sure that's going to be enough, and those spikes could cause real problems in urgent care demand.
So it's not. I mean, we've had some evidence in other inquiries about that shift from the acute sector and that budget into the community. Does anyone see that significant shift from the acute sector into primary care or into the community? And you want to take that, Rachel?
I go back to my original point. I just don't think the budget gives us enough detail to be able to track whether or not that is happening, including the shift to acute to community. I mean, obviously, we're talking a significant proportion of the budget goes in the core grants to boards, and I know the committee has done separate inquiries on how then those boards have chosen to allocate those funds locally, and the areas in which the funding is specified is a relatively small proportion of the overall health budget. I do think the level 4 detail is quite interesting when you start looking at some of those specific budgets of how often it's possible to see that certain monies have been transferred to health board responsibilities, which presumably therefore means that's actually their part of their uplift. The expectation of what boards will do for their core funding is increasing as the Healthy Working Lives programme moves to core funding, as additional waiting times funding moves to core funding. So what you can start to see are where some of the pressures are arising, but I genuinely struggle to answer the question because I don't think the budget gives us enough detail.
Anyone else? Annie?
Thank you. Just to mention, I'm sure you're aware of this already, that Audit Scotland is in the middle of a study of reshaping care for older people and the change funds up to this point, and I think a specific focus for them will be the extent to which the shift balance has happened from acute to community. So that's kind of on the way. And I think that will be quite a rigorous study, and will give the committee some of the answers that it's looking for. But I think the question about where the budget is in all this I come back to this being part of the discussion, and I know there are lots of tensions around this in relation to the integration bill, between what the Scottish Government wants to do with its budget and how much discretion it wants to give to local partners to make those decisions within the context of joint strategic commissioning. And so far, anecdotally, there are some signs that things are starting to shift, but I don't think it's anywhere near the kind of scale that people have been expecting to see. And there's some concern that some of the Change Fund has been used to fund very kind of short-term preventive interventions, and once the Change Fund stops, so will they. So the Change Fund was supposed to be a kind of lever, I think, to shift the great bulk of spending that was behind it. And in fact, it has been sometimes used in very creative ways, but almost as an isolated project fund. And I think that's the difficulty that we've got.
That's the question, because we look for certainty. We see as a committee legislation being used. We see initiatives to change the culture to allow that to happen. We looked at the budget to see if that's going to drive that, and how serious are we about moving to that preventative agenda and that integration that we need?
Well, I guess if you look at the budget in the context of other policy initiatives that are out there, I'm thinking of single outcome agreements that now require prevention plans to be added to them, those kinds of initiatives. The kind of general direction of travel is this way. But I think the frustration that everybody feels, and I suspect the Scottish Government does too, is you can set the conditions for something and then it still doesn't actually happen. So how do you drive that behaviour is the challenge that we've got.
Supplementary on that?
It's just on this.
Well, I've got a wee list. I've got Richard first and then you, Rhoda. I've got you down, Mark, yeah.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Convener. I listened intently. I think I shouldn't miss the comment in regards to what Matt said earlier. Do you think, I've got several questions, and maybe when you're answering the first question, Matt, you may want to come back and say whether, in fact, NHS Scotland has too many targets set by politicians, which are then criticised by other politicians. In regards to the main cost pressures that are identified within the budget, I'll list them: pay, demographics and new technologies, new drugs and volume and maintenance. Can I first of all ask the panel's view on the announcement last week in England that there will be no pay rise for staff, but in Scotland at the weekend the Cabinet Secretary gave the commitment there will be a pay rise in Scotland for staff. Have there any comments by the panel in regards to that?
Matt?
I'm happy to take both of those, Convener. I think Civic Scotland would welcome politicians being more on the same page, doing less better than arguing the toss over whose budget's right and whose target's right. I think as I said when I opened, the NHS is a big, complex service, and it's a service we all, I think, hold dear in our hearts. So, what I do think is that I think we need to start to reshape some of the discussion about those outputs, and those outputs need to be on quality and patient journey and patient experience, maybe rather than traffic light systems and screeds of paper. But so I think we could always do with less targets but better delivered. I think in terms of the pay rise, I think we've gone on record as not supporting the English Minister for Health's proposal or recommendation to the PRB. The PRB will obviously set what the pay level is. I was at least content to hear the Cabinet Secretary confirm over the weekend that Scotland and the Scottish Government will honour the existing 1%, but let's be absolutely clear, that is not a pay rise for health workers in Scotland. That is a continued pay cut, and I think there's a number of pieces of analysis out there that suggests that NHS workers have lost somewhere like 10% in their earnings in real terms over the last few years. So I hate to use the word welcome on a pay cut, but I think we recognise certainly the Scottish Government's commitment to honour the existing PRB agreement, and certainly if there's an opportunity for us to increase that, then obviously that's an opportunity we would gladly take.
Anyone else? Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, just to back up what Matt's saying, I mean, we're now obviously waiting for the PRB recommendations. That was a submission. RCN and staff side generally have put their own submissions into that as a UK negotiating exercise. That is a UK exercise, and we're waiting to see that. And I think what was interesting for me this year was reading the paper that the budget advisor to the Finance Committee had made around the impact on economic growth of the onward sort of downward spiral in real terms of the public sector pay. Obviously she was referring specifically to Scotland, but I don't think that's different anywhere across the UK. So in terms of our membership, we would want to see a UK deal for a UK workforce.
Annie.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Just simply to make the observation that in the world we're living in, the health and social care workforce is employed by a very diverse range of organisations. Not all of them are public sector. And there's a very substantial proportion of staff within the voluntary sector who have had pay cuts and haven't seen a pay rise for a very, very long time because of the pressures that I have rehearsed ad infinitum, I think, with this committee around procurement and tendering and downward pressure on voluntary sector budgets in particular. So I do think we need to kind of look at these discussions sometimes in the context of the wider workforce, because we're not really just talking about public sector workforce anymore. And just to raise within that the commitment within the budget to living wage, I think is very important. But, yet again, we have a situation where that is not going to be extended towards those contracted providers who are working to deliver public services. And I think, the gap between those workers is just continuing to widen. I think that's a real cause for concern.
Anyone else? Donald, Harley, you should BMA must have something to say on this issue.
Well, I think I'd very much echo
given your submission.
Yeah, I think I'd very much echo what Matt had to say. Really, it doesn't really need me to rehearse the arguments that staff in the NHS have been working under increased pressure in the last few years against a backdrop of diminished resources and seeing real terms pay cuts, which is hard to bear and fairly demoralising. Recognise that the unprecedented changes that have been proposed in south of the border, there's no intention to follow that here, and that has to be welcome. But equally, we need to look at the backdrop that Matt just referred to.
Some of the other issues that flow from this, like the GP contract and the Scottish contract, particularly in the integration of care and others, we can maybe get back to some of that. But some of the other scrutiny that we've applied to budgets here in the past boasted that bank nursing was down, overtime was down, etc. So in this mix of the wages and the salary, which we all welcome that confirmation, it's not resolving some of these these issues that have been in people's submissions about nursing numbers down, posts unfilled, increased bank nursing, increased overtime. So what's going on here that we've and the GP contract that doesn't match our ambition for the involvement of GPs and integration in other areas. Yes, Donald, please.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned GPs in particular, and of course this committee will be aware that they're, for the most part, they're not employees by the NHS, but they're contractors to the NHS, so they're managing essentially a small business. And although as a segment of the population they're relatively well rewarded, nevertheless they've seen a very, very significant decrease in their net drawings in the last 7 years, and that's against a background of their practice costs rising inexorably, and they're absorbing and bearing all those increases, and at the same time being asked to do more and more. Within that population, you have a third of that group who are 55 and over are looking at the exit door. And it's a reality, you know, if you keep squeezing and squeezing, and there's no recognition of that fact, then people will ultimately vote with their feet, and that potentially is what we are looking at, is a crisis in manning in general practice. Hopefully that won't happen, but there's certainly the potential for that.
Rachel?
But I think obviously our submission had focused to some extent on the change to nursing numbers that we've seen over the last few years, and though we've seen a welcome very slight increase in the most recent statistics in terms of nursing numbers within the NHS, I think, as you pointed out, we've also seen a rise in the use of temporary filling of posts. And the only thing that I can think is we cut fast. I mean, we cut hard and we cut fast as budgets became tight, because pay is one of the biggest budgets, if the biggest budget that NHS boards have to deal with. And yes, we do have to reorganise services and do things differently. But I think, particularly in a post-Francis world, people have stopped and realised that maybe they now need to do something a little bit different, which is to bring the staff who deliver the frontline care back on board, given that we know that there are parallels between the number of nurses available to care for people and the quality of outcomes that people have. So whilst we welcome the slight increase, I think one of the things in the budget that you can see is obviously that nursing line I was referring to at the beginning. A lot of that is to do, some of that is to do with the fact that we have, over a number of years, until very welcomely last year, cut the number of nurses going into pre-registration education as well. And we're now seeing that come through the budget because we're not having to spend so much on bursaries. Our risk is that we keep going back to a boom and bust on numbers, and it tends to go with the economy, and that isn't a sustainable way forward for the NHS, particularly given the demography that we're looking at and the pressures that we're putting on staff under, whether that's in the acute sector or in a hugely, hopefully, reformed community sector.
Kim?
It's always distressing to hear about cuts that are happening across with our health colleagues. I suppose it's back to that idea of, if you're wanting a particular outcome, then you've got to think about who is it you need in the team to deliver that outcome. From an AHP Federation, from an allied health professions point of view, what we need is balanced teams. And if we're having changes with our health, if there's changes in the balance of nursing and health and medics, basically, we need to balance the other members of that team and workforce. So it's back to that discussion earlier, but just to highlight that the AHPs have experienced cuts sometimes up to 20% in their budget. We don't have bank cover, we don't have maternity cover. So, where there's workforce issues arising in health and the doctors, then I would really ask that view of those inputs, i.e. the workforce that deliver the outcomes that were all key, that view's widened to the rest of the health team, and that there are very particular issues for those groups, for example, like HPs, who haven't necessarily had the profile in relation to the workforce formulas and that kind of thing. And because they're not profiled, it's the sorts of experience that those workforces are having isn't necessarily as well known.
Matt?
Thanks, Convener. I mean, just to pick up, if I may, Annie's point about other sectors. Of course, Unison supports the proper pay for all people in the service, and I think we can make a direct link between the living wage and tackling health inequality. I think that's an issue that's often missed in that debate. In terms of the point raised, Convener, I think I've got some sympathy for the Scottish Government on this issue. I think there is a disjoint in the information provided. I think there is a suggestion that we've got more, in particular, nurses than we've had in recent years. And when you start to add up what health boards say they are employing, that's the kind of conclusion that you might naturally reach. When you start to delve below those figures, though, and look at actual whole-time equivalent and actual headcount, people in post at a particular point in time, then the information suggests something slightly different. And certainly in June of this year, Glasgow Health Board had somewhere around, off the top of my head, 1,800 whole-time equivalent nurse vacancies, predominantly which were nursing, in their workforce is the highest it's ever been. So at a time when people are saying there are more nurses than ever, it would appear that there are less nurses in wards delivering services. And just to back that kind of general view up, that's why bank costs are going up. That's why excess hours costs are going up, and they have done, particularly in that health board in the last 12 months. And I was looking yesterday at starting to pull some statistics down from the Nurse and Midwifery Council, which seems to suggest that there are less registered nurses and midwives in Scotland than there have been in previous years. So if there are less registered nurses registered with the NMC, then that for me is quite a telling statistic. And it seems to suggest that somewhere the information coming through from Scottish Government into the Parliament is out of kilter. And I think we do need to do a significant piece of work on that. I think there's a fundamental issue about nursing and staffing levels in general, but also nursing levels given the percentage of nurses that there are in the NHS and midwives that there are in the NHS, making up a big significant chunk of the workforce. The workforce staffing cost, the pay bill, is about 50% for most boards. Boards faced with financial pressures find it much easier to manage those vacancies through the system and to make the financial savings. Now, I don't think they'll admit to that, but I think that's absolutely what is happening. There is vacancy drag in a number of areas right across the system, and that is having an impact on efficiency, and it is having an impact on cost and quality, and I think that's absolutely key as we go forward. And just in terms of that general debate, I mean, the other day I looked at some stuff where a service redesign seemed to suggest that registered nurses now starting to work a 14-hour day was the way forward. Now, apart from the fact that that breaches the Working Time Directive, apart from the fact that that has a direct quality impact on quality of care, you know, is that the message going forward? I certainly hope not.
Donald Harney.
Just very much following in on that point, there was an excellent couple of articles in the Herald newspaper yesterday about junior doctors' working hours, and it reflects really a bit of a culture in the NHS of playing with numbers. So that on paper we're meeting the Working Time Directive and everything is fine, but the reality is the way rotas are constructed to massage over the gaps that are created by the efficiency savings, people are working 90 hours at a stretch in a week, 7 hours of 12-hour shifts, which is neither good for their health and well-being, nor the health and well-being of patients. And ultimately, that is something that needs to be looked at.
Richard.
My second point, I think, back in Convener, was in regard to maintenance, but mainly targeted to energy consumption. I had the luck before coming to this place of being involved, as I've previously stated, with out-of-hours doctor service and worked in various hospitals. The one thing that struck me going through those hospitals during the day and at night was the amount of energy that they consume, and lights being left on all the time throughout, and no system where if you went out the room the lights went off, or even when you went into the room the lights went on. Do you think we're doing enough to reduce our energy consumption, which again is a high cost and getting even dearer within hospitals or within the NHS as a whole, in order to facilitate savings which then can be put into pay or other services throughout the NHS?
Any takers? Matt?
Convener, I mean, I think this is an issue that health boards genuinely do struggle with. And I mean, I know that they regularly, certainly before they had the National Buying Consortium, they regularly looked at energy providers and tried to get, you know, more kilowatts for the pound, as it were. And I know that in terms of capital maintenance, you know, all boards have certainly programmes to look at, you know, boilers and you know, when they're doing rewirings or refurbishments, then obviously they try to get the best piece of kit that they can for the pound that they have. I think in terms of potentially the way forward, sorry, I should mention new builds, of course, have helped arguably profits wiped out when we've done PFI, PPP, but that's another debate maybe. I think going forward, I think it might help if boards were encouraged to do a bit more of that spend to save funding. The challenge, I suppose, politically, is that if someone is being told that they need to wait an extra week for their hip operation, but somebody's getting triple glazed windies in an office, then there's a big political kind of agenda in there. And certainly, I think the way that other services, I mean, I'm mindful that a number of years ago, local authorities got some spend to save money specifically ring-fenced, or whether that's a way forward to tackle some of the energy efficiency agenda. I mean, I think that's maybe something worth investigating.
Richard makes the point about the efficiency drive. £270 million was taken out of the health service and efficiencies, and they've got to do it all, well, not all, but about 80% of it again next year. What's the impact of that going to be? Rachel?
I mean, I noticed you were picking the Audit Scotland report up there, and I know the Auditor General last year had spoken on the publication of their review that the low-hanging fruit is gone, and boards are having to be ever more creative to come up with the savings that they've agreed with government. Our submission highlighted some of the work that we've been doing, looking at those savings plans on the basis of the financial agreements that were made at the start of this year, as well as the achievements of last year in terms of those sustainable savings, rather than the one-off savings that Matt was talking about of holding a vacancy open for an extra 2 months to save a bit of salary, which is not a sustainable way forward. And I do think boards have a really tough challenge to continue to make those savings and to make up the savings that they didn't make the previous year in terms of sustainable savings. And obviously it's one of those areas we've been talking about targets. They have an annual target that they have to meet. And sometimes these can be very long term. Matt was talking about invest to save in terms of energy. The difficulty is that sometimes that is not going to come to fruition within the timescales that they've been set to make those savings. We also keep coming back to the point that we don't actually really genuinely know that what are being called savings are savings in the technical term of a cash releasing efficiency saving. Sometimes they're just a way of cutting things out of a budget, top slicing a budget to make it work. And that then leaves the pressure for the frontline staff to work out how on earth to deliver what's expected of them with a smaller cut budget from the start of the year. So I don't envy boards at this stage. I think we keep going back to them with the same request, which is make recurring efficiency savings. I've already said how if you look into the level 4 detail, the inflationary uplift that's given to boards often is consumed with the additional responsibilities that go with the non-recurring funds starting to drop and the responsibility transferring across. And I just think it's a continued added pressure. Should boards be efficient? Of course they should. I don't think anyone could say otherwise. But the way in which we manage that target perhaps needs a little bit more creative thinking.
Annie?
About efficiency, I mean, and particularly in the context of integration and what we've been saying about prevention and upstream activity, I think the system needs to be efficient rather than individual outlets of the system. I mean, why would you continue to drive efficiency in an institution which actually could be closed? And if we could find a way of keeping people out of it. So I think looking at efficiency in very narrow terms as to this hospital or this clinic or whatever, it's the whole system that needs to be efficient. And certainly I agree very much with Rachel about what might be called an efficiency and what might not actually turn out to be one. A city council, which I shall spare their blushes, imposed a 5% budget cut on voluntary sector social care budgets last year. And this was sold to the council on the basis that this would come out of admin, efficiencies to admin. Now, if you think that a voluntary sector budget is 85% workforce, then actually demanding a 5% cut to admin means actually a 30% cut to admin, and it just can't be done. So, we've got quite a lot of experience of sustaining efficiencies which are in fact very serious cuts, and it from going back to the previous discussion, it does come out of our workforce, unfortunately.
Rhoda.
Yeah, can I maybe wheel us back a bit to kind of how we spend and how the budget, I suppose, directs how the direction of travel. I know we spoke about this earlier, but Donald Harley mentioned, and specifically in A&E, and if I could use that as an example, the direction of travel, which has been publicly stated and everybody signed up to, is to move from acute care into community care, shifting the balance of care. But we've seen recently, and we do have a budget line about kind of winter planning and the like, we see more and more people coming into A&E, which is actually a policy direction, a spending direction, but actually the impact has been the exact opposite of what has been intended. Why is that? What can be done differently? Is the budget, what can we do with the budget to change that direction of travel?
The reasons are many and complex, and you'll be aware there's an expert group looking at unscheduled care currently, and we're doing some work internally on this as well. But it's things like, as I alluded to earlier, bottlenecks within the system. If there is nowhere to receive the discharge, then that flows backwards all the way from the discharge through the acute receiving back into A&E, and that causes a bottleneck in there. If people aren't aware of other options, it's the place that's always open, and you'll find people heading in that direction. I mean, there's work going on with NHS 24 currently to try and take some of that pressure off, but one of the concerns that we've had hitherto is that the system is quite risk averse, and therefore the easiest thing to do is to point people towards A&E, and people allude from time to time about GPs doing more, but it comes back to the point I made earlier. You can only, it's not that GPs are unwilling to do it. In fact, most of the out of hours care, for example, is already provided by GPs. But if you want GPs to do more over and above the quite lengthy high pressured hours they're already doing, you're looking at an expansion in general practice and a commensurate resourcing. So there's a whole lot of issues there in the mix. It's not really easy to give a glib answer to that. But it certainly can't be ignored. The people who talk to us who work in A&E and also in acute receiving say it's very much getting towards breaking point. And already we see the fact that it's very hard to recruit people to work in A&E. So if we have problems now, there's an even greater long-term problem building, because it just does take some kind of saint and dedicated person to want to work in that sort of environment when it's so intense. You're going to be constantly working over with a lot of physical and emotional demands full on. And within nursing and medicine, people say, well, actually, there are easier ways to do my job and earn a living. So long term, we need to make it a more attractive place for professionals to be, and we need to look at all those areas to ensure that treatment is done in a more planned way rather than in an unplanned way. Some of that, of course, will be around patient education, and a lot more could be done in that regard. But in so many aspects of health and health care, patient education only goes so far, because not everybody wants to hear the message or has time to hear the message. So all those areas need to be looked at.
Kim and then Rachel.
In terms of pressure on A&E, I could just draw the committee, I've got an example here from OTs, in fact, occupational therapists, about how they've done some work on reducing the demand on A&E services. There was a project over a 3-month period where they reduced 126 admissions. It's obviously quite a small project, but it's an example, I think, of how in trying to meet the demand, instead of thinking let's just carry on doing more of what we're doing right now, let's start doing things differently. Let's start thinking about who could relieve the demand on our nursing medic colleagues in A&E. I think that what we need to try and do is start optimising the use of the current capability and capacity. That's part of efficiency as well. And going back to the question around efficiency, what are we not capturing at the moment in terms of the capability and capacity, for example, in the AHP workforce, in order to prevent people having to have, preventing people falling, preventing people getting to the state of being in a nursing home, for example, having an aspiration and pneumonia, having to be admitted to acute care, those sorts of things. There's an awful lot that we could do to prevent people getting to the crisis where they need to get to A&E. And I think we need to think, somebody used the term, or I think it was Rachel said, thinking creatively. We have to start doing things differently, and that means that we have to start introducing different people into the preventative care. We've got to stop thinking of healthcare starting with doctors and nurses when people become seriously ill. And obviously prevention and health inequalities is all about that, but we've got to start thinking, are we using the capability and capacity of the full workforce, including obviously HPs, in order to do that preventative work? And we'd argue that no, we're not at the moment, because we're still thinking, let's just deal with people as they come to the door. And we need to get an awful lot better at preventing them even thinking about going to the door.
Rachel?
No, I would agree with much of what Kim has just said. And for me, it comes back to Annie's point about efficiency, which is we need to be thinking about the whole system. I think one of the good things that I'm pleased to see with the expert group on unscheduled care that was referred to earlier is that there are groups looking at both how we improve the flow through hospital, but also the community. How do we improve the flow in and out of hospital? Because I think the headlines on A&E are justified. I think there are huge pressures on A&E. But I also think it's one of those areas where it's easy to see. It's the front door, it's the 24/7 front door to the acute sector where people are in the greatest need. And actually what goes on going in and what goes on behind the scenes of the flow through is in some ways just as important and adds to that. And I would really agree with Kim. I think, again, I don't envy the government. I think what they've got is a crisis that's happening now. And they really are trying to invest money in how they deal with that. And in trying to do that in the short term, I think what we do have to ward against is just throwing money at what we already know, because what we already know currently isn't working as well as it could. And we need to keep thinking about how do we look outside of the box to invest in those services that will get people through more quickly, that will ensure discharge happens well, and will stop people going in the first place. I mean, for me, it links directly to the integration agenda. If you have someone sitting in A&E who needs to be discharged, but for some reason, because health and social work have not linked up, there isn't a social work available to actually do the discharge planning and get that person out quickly, then we have a problem. And that goes right back to the front door of the hospital. If we have a problem with out-of-hours services in some rural areas, which we know we do, then why aren't we thinking creatively about, as we are in Grampian, for example, around developing nursing roles into delivering those out-of-hours services and having an impact where we know that works? We're not always, I think, looking in the round in the way that Kim has suggested. And I do understand there is a pressure now, and we are coming back to the winter, and we know that makes things hard. And we have beds opened last year that still haven't closed across the summer. Where is the capacity going to be to allow us to have an outbreak of flu, for example, this year? I do think we have to think really creatively and quite quickly.
Annie?
Yes, thank you. One of the key drivers, if not the key driver of the whole integration project, is to reduce emergency admissions. And it comes back to what Rachel was saying about, and what I was saying earlier about whole systems, because, when you look at what is happening to social care services now, some of your answer arrives. People's care packages are being cut, people are being charged more for them. People are having pressure piled on them by welfare reform. Enormous cost pressures are being put on the community support services that are there to keep people out of hospital. And so, you know, as night follows day, you will get more pressure on the acute system. And I come back to my kind of point that I made at the beginning, that, you know, while notwithstanding the change fund and while that's all very welcome, there's not enough driver in this, but there aren't enough levers in this budget to force upstream spending. That's what needs to happen.
Yeah, because it's a familiar, it's not new. Certainly not new to any that's expressed an interest in this or previous committees. I mean, we had the care report with A&E, not Andy Care, but care report that identifies some of these issues, and we've still got 15 minutes to visits. You know, there's nobody looking after people's hydration, nutrition at a very local level. They end up in hospital, urine infection, don't come back out again. We know all of this. The frustration for committee members here is that we have to identify some of this, and we look to a budget that should drive that. And you've said, Annie, that this is not a game changer in any way. It's not even this. Is it a step up to address that preventative agenda? Is there anything in here that should encourage us that we're making a shift change? Yes.
I think if you combine it with the discussions that you've already had in this committee and elsewhere around integration, what I keep coming back to is if joint strategic commissioning between all the stakeholders, that's where this will happen, if it happens at all. I'm sure you've had cabinet secretaries before you in this committee saying that the key to this is that the money will lose its identity once it gets into that integrated pot. So it will no longer be, you know, social care money or acute care money or primary care. It will just be money, and then it will be directed towards the kinds of activities and services and supports that will deliver the outcomes. And I think that's where it's going to happen, if it's going to happen at all. But I think I'd echo some of what my colleague Martin Syme told this committee about. It's not just the cash that needs to lose its identity, it's some of the characters as well, locally.
Kim? Matt?
I think just really briefly, the question is, picking up on what you just said, it's at a local level. Does it better incentivise boards to do the long-term thinking, to stick with the programme when they've got a successful project that's been short-term funded? Does it allow boards to? Yeah, that's basically it. Does it incentivise them to stick with the work? And if the conditions of getting access to this money doesn't, then it's not going to change the way they behave.
Me this morning, how do we get to this long-term thinking? With the budget set up annually, whatever, it's difficult to plan, and workforce planning, it's difficult to shift. We've got £270 million to take out of this. How do we create long-term thinking with a budget like will be presented? We've discussed here about the outcomes, the targets, how do we allow people to, with the budget process and all of its focus on targets and everything else, to get us to a stage where some people have said some of that's preventing us getting to the stage of long-term thinking? Matt, you were next. I'll put that on you.
Thanks, Duncan. Kevin, I mean, I think to answer your first question, I mean, I think the budget is for all sorts of reasons a steady as she goes budget, and I think we need to recognise that the significant characteristic of that is that it's a more for less budget, as all budgets are in the current climate. To take your kind of second point, I mean, thankfully, I'm not a politician, you know. I mean, you're the people who are elected to, you know, drive this agenda forward. I mean, we can offer advice, we can offer opinion, and you'll get plenty of that, of course. But ultimately, it's politicians who need to take that view. And I suppose in an ideal world, you know, you would devise the quality service, and then you would say, right, how much is it going to cost me, rather than how much have I got it. What do I need to do? And I suppose it kind of takes me in a kind of side thought to some of the debate that Robert Calderwood, who's the Chief Executive in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, kicked off a few years ago, and I think still goes around the Chief Executive's group about, you know, when will we be asked to stop doing something in the NHS? Because when you stop doing something, then you can start to create some of this extra money or extra efficiency or get to a level playing field. Now, you know, I'm not going to sit here, I wouldn't imagine anybody would want to sit here and say this is what we should stop doing, because, you know, we all are users of the service and we all have views about that. But in simple terms, I think Annie's point's a fair point about losing some of the personalities and that. I mean, I think the challenge with the integration debate just now, as I've said earlier, is that people are arguing about process, people are arguing about structure, people are arguing about how many bums they can get on seats and who has voting rights and who doesn't have voting rights. And these things are kind of important, I suppose. But if the ultimate objective of integrated social and adult care is to prevent people needing to go into acute hospitals for a long period of time and to tackle childhood obesity and you know, smoking related illness and all the things that we would want to do in this country, then at some point we need to stop those process debates and get on with devising a structure that delivers. And I think you can deliver it, but I think it needs people to be bold and innovative and a bit brave around that and stop pandering to the vested interests.
Kim?
Absolutely. Vested interests. We're all in. Well, it's a collective activity. I stopped there. I stopped on time. I do think, you know, that you have the arguments about bums on seats, but it's not the bums on seats. It's the brains, the knowledge, the skills, the experience that are part of that creative thinking. Someone's making decisions about how the money's distributed from the central pot. Someone's making decisions about how the money's spent locally. Well, let's make sure all the knowledge, skills, experience, the whole capacity and capability available to the people around that table is well understood in order that there are creative decisions being made. And it may sound like a discussion about bums on seats, but it's actually a discussion about the intelligence that's going into making those decisions, really.
Rachel?
I mean, I would answer your question with a number of points. I would agree with what Matt has been saying throughout the session, that if what we're going to do is improve care, then we need to rationalise our priorities around a set of quality outcomes. And we need to be really clear what they are and not keep proliferating outcomes and indicators and heat targets and so on and so forth. We need to be absolutely clear, and that needs to come from the top. I think we then need to find a way of making clear how those budgets are going towards meeting those outcomes, which I think we haven't quite made a step to nationally, nor locally in a lot of places, though there are pilots for how that may be better done, and I think that's really welcome. I think the budget has to be more transparent so that we're really clear where efficiencies are being made, that they are genuine efficiencies, and where responsibilities and money is transferring from non-recurring to recurring funding, that is absolutely clear so that we know the hand that NHS boards are being given to deliver what's being asked of them. I think if we could rationalise the quality outcomes that we're really aiming at, we could also rationalise the number of groups that are currently operating. I think what we have at the moment is a genuine commitment to try and do something differently, and I think everyone has the pressure at their shoulder for doing this. One of the difficulties is the number of separate, disparate groups that are being set up to try and look at it, and I know we have difficulties populating them all, and I can't imagine that we're on our own from those around the table. You know, the number of different groups that are looking at workforce issues is enormous. You know, we can sit round a table pretty much every day a week with a group that's looking at what to do with the workforce. There is something about how do we bring this together for that whole systems approach that makes sure that we're being efficient in not only how we deliver things, but also efficient in how we have the discussions about how we deliver things, so that we're not setting many trains running in different directions at the same time that just will not link at the front line. So there's some ideas.
We get Rhoda back in again, but it was just whether the annual budget process was a barrier to developing longer term. Rhoda?
Yeah, I think given that we're looking at the budget and you know, even going back to what people said about the money for winter planning, could that be better spent in providing the services to keep people out of A&E, or are we just crisis managing the crisis that's happening? There's not the funding to deal with it, therefore we have to spend up front to deal with the implications of that lack of funding back in the community.
Any takers? Rachel?
I mean, boards have now been asked to produce unscheduled care plans, which does include winter planning, and I think that's a welcome move forward to link that winter planning, which sometimes will be crisis management, and we're never going to get away from sometimes winter planning will be crisis management, to a much more strategic overview of how they're going to deal with their unscheduled care. Now, we need to see what comes from that and how those actually then turn into operation. But I think there are, at least under the auspices of the expert group, some moves towards not only funding every year a crisis in bed numbers come the winter. Have we got it right? Clearly not yet, but there are at least, I think, some steps along the way that are encouraging.
It seems to me that there are things you can't plan for, like a bad winter with a lot of snow. You, of course, get more people pitching up at A&E because of falls and breaks and the like, and again, a flu epidemic. So there are things that will happen. But my understanding of the situation is that there's a lot of people pitching up inappropriately who could have been dealt with elsewhere, or steps could have been taken to prevent them going in the first place. And I suppose that's where we need to have the spending.
Anyone else? Rhoda, anything else?
No, that's fine.
Mark, please.
Thanks, Convener. It seems like a long time has passed since I put my hand up, but I'll come back to the point there, because the point I wanted to make was around health inequalities. And I wonder if, when we're looking at the health inequalities heading within the budget, if we run the risk of the health budget being the wrong budget to be looking at in terms of the health inequalities agenda, because to me, when the health service comes into contact with people, generally that's after the point at which these health inequalities have manifested themselves. So I guess the question would be, is it appropriate to look at the health budget in terms of the health inequalities agenda? If so, at what point of the health budget do we look at that? And what other budgets should this committee not be looking at, because it's not our role to do so, but have cognizance of in terms of the health inequalities agenda?
Any takers? Matt?
I mean, Chair, I think it's a fair point. I mean, we know that health inequalities is much more than the direct interface with the NHS, and we know, and I think we generally accept that the NHS deals with, in many ways, in the acute side of the house, deals with the product of health inequality. So I think you're, in some sense, correct. You know, we need, and arguably that's where the integration agenda should drive us. You know, we should get to a point where, you know, housing and work and education and all of these things are considered more holistically in the health inequalities debate. But I do think, you know, that there are people out there, particularly our primary care colleagues, do a lot of work around health inequalities as well, including you know, GPs right down to, you know, staff nurses who will come in and take bloods in someone's home, for example, or change a dressing. And I think as we move forward, I mean, one of the big frustrations of in particular health visitors and district nurses in the past has been that they feel their work quite often isn't valued from a health inequalities perspective. You know, they do a lot of soft work with people and with families around the health inequalities agenda that's really hard to quantify. Yeah, and so I mean, I think if the committee were minded to try and pull some of those other strands together and get a kind of more holistic view, I think that would be quite an interesting exercise.
Rachel, then Kim.
I mean, I do think there is an issue that for the Health Committee on how it does look beyond the health budget to the areas that have impact. You know, if we're looking at health inequalities, how can housing not have an impact on somebody's sense of equality and their good well-being? In terms of what Matt was saying, yes, of course, there's limits to what the NHS as a body can do in terms of reducing inequalities. And I think the committee's own deliberations around health inequalities has shown what a complex and somewhat intractable difficulty Scotland has around the issue. Where health does have, I think, a very particular contribution is around what we now know is that very early years intervention. You know, that if we can prevent ill health developing because we are around supporting parents and very young children, then we know that health has a very particular role in there. The health visiting role in particular as a universal service should be in and among that all the time. Now, obviously, I've already spoken to our disappointment around the education budget, but we do have an issue where our health visiting population is ageing faster than any other nursing population. We still don't have anything like enough health visitors going through the system to ensure that we have a sustainable universal service. We welcome the additional checks that have been put in for children, but that does mean caseloads are now very heavy and we do have vacancies that are proving very hard to fill. And so to me, that is one area where I think very directly the health budget in and of itself could have shown a far greater emphasis on those upstream activities that Annie's been talking about. Because I think if we can get that right, then we potentially, over generations, knock on the head an awful lot of the problems that we currently see. We certainly welcome the Family Nurse Partnership additional money that is in the health inequalities line. And I think that is very well evidenced, targeted support, and we're delighted to see that rolling out to communities to give support to very young first-time mothers. But I think we've had the debates here before around the Family Nurse Partnership, and it is very targeted, it is very specific who can go into it, and they are very, very attractive jobs for health visitors to move into. Very small caseloads, fantastic education, and very interesting work. And we do have an issue about making sure that we retain enough health visitors with appropriate caseloads with the right coverage to provide a good universal preventative service.
Kim?
Yeah, the allied health professions couldn't agree more that we should be trying to consider the budgets in the round. Just picking up on what Rachel was saying about early years, there is definitely there's certainly instances of a disjoint certainly at local level, and perhaps mirrored in the way that funding's distributed centrally, between, for example, funding in early years, where, if I can use an example from my own profession, speech and language therapists working with young children so that they're ready to learn at school, money coming from local authorities and those projects stopping. That isn't we're back to that question of, well, how is the health inequalities money being spent, and making sure that we think of that money, again, back to this, the way that that money is distributed. Are we taking into account all the capabilities and capacities? And I suppose just the sort of, there is a disjoint at local level. How are we ensuring that disjoint doesn't happen at a national level? Incredibly challenging for the committee to do that. But that certainly an incentive, doing something to encourage and enable consideration of budgets across the piece would help incredibly at a local level, really, to make sure the right people are playing their part.
Annie?
Convener, I mean, I think the Scottish Government is to be commended for its attempts to break down kind of silo thinking locally, but I mean, perversely, the budget is constructed as a series of silos, and it's always struck me as rather odd that this committee's focus is on Chapter 3, which is the health budget, which talks about health and social care, but social care money is not in there. It's in Chapter 12, which is local government, and that's always struck me as rather peculiar, I must say. And going back to comments that you made before about national performance framework and how spending is aligned with some of the targets and the outcomes that the Scottish Government has set itself, I think to construct a budget around that would actually make much more sense. But in the context of health inequalities, which was the question, I think local government budget absolutely requires some scrutiny there. I think it would also be useful to pick up some of the some of the money that's been put into mitigating the impact of welfare reform when it comes to health inequalities, because I think that's going to be very, I'm sure this committee has heard this from a range of other people about the potential impact of that on health and health inequalities. And the particular bit that I'm always looking for in here is the third sector stuff, because that's where a lot of the community supports come out, and there is, you know, a great deal of enthusiasm and support for the third sector when you read this. When you actually kind of chase the money down the various rabbit holes, you find that not a lot of it is going into the third sector, and I think that's something that the committee could perhaps help us with. There's certainly, going back to the Change Fund, there's certainly some commitments there that the third sector will be involved in how decisions about how that's spent, and I think that will be absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think that's very helpful. I guess the other point to tie into, I mean, obviously a number of the budgets that have been raised are the responsibility of other committees to look at, but I don't think it would hurt for us as a committee to give consideration to how we might influence some of the scrutiny that's taking place in other committees around the health inequalities agenda. But the other point that I think it ties into in terms of the health inequalities agenda is the shift to preventative spending, and whether that is manifesting itself in terms of how budgets are being spent locally. I mean, I know I often feel that sometimes we close the door after the horse has bolted in some respects, because we're discussing the high level figures here, which are then distributed to health boards, and we then get the health boards in and say, so how did you spend that money, rather than maybe having a discussion in advance of them spending that money. I wonder what the prevailing view among the witnesses is around the way in which the health boards are using the money they're given to cultivate a preventative agenda at the front line.
So I was just taking one of your points to the clerk for noting in terms of.
That's exciting. That's never happened to me before.
No, I think you made a good point about not just what the focus about what they've spent in the past, but maybe that process could start for us about how they are planning for the next year rather than focusing on looking back. I think it's a good point. The equality statement that accompanied the draft budget, has anyone had a look at the equality statement in respect to that? No. Yeah, that's good. That's your homework then. But you know, just when Mark raised that issue, there is an equality statement that I think you know, we'd welcome views on if you're not burdened with time, that we can maybe refer to and you know, get a view on as well. It might help us in this overall.
Just to say that there was a question at the tail end of my
sorry,
point
I was
around.
Distracted.
That's okay.
My apologies, Mark.
That's okay. It was just around how preventative agenda has been cultivated at a local level.
Okay. Anyone? Kim?
Just to say that AHPs, a range of AHPs have taken up the opportunities that have been offered by some short-term funding projects. But as the Health Committee will find out itself soon, hopefully, as a result of the survey that you've been doing around speech and language therapy, which is obviously just one of the AHPs, that these short-term projects tend to, there's a retraction in the workforce that's delivering some of that preventative work, and also the projects are short-term and they're not being continued. So I think there are, as we say in our written submission, it's what happens to those short-term projects. So I don't think the shift has necessarily happened. Again, the way of thinking, the creative way of thinking at a local level about how we actually use the money to fully exploit the capability and capacity available, there's still not made that leap. Really.
So can I just have a wee supplementary on that, which is how do we model on preventative spend? Because I know that often we will receive representations from a range of organisations, and Kim and I have had discussions around this in the past, which says if you spend £1 on this, then you will save X pounds elsewhere. What modelling is being done to analyse whether that is actually happening? So when the health boards spend that pound on, say, speech and language therapy, they can then analyse if in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time they are going to save X pounds.
Can I say I don't know?
Okay. Maybe one for the health
but
boards.
I suppose the primary message is that from the AHP professional bodies perspective, we're not seeing a good awareness of the capability and capacity, the evidence base in relation to prevention from an AHP perspective. So perhaps my other colleagues who sit on many more groups than AHPs and have more sort of those positions in terms of decision making might have a better idea.
Rachel?
The RCN is doing some work across the UK at the moment with the Office of Public Management. We've been doing some of that in Scotland, where we've been trying our best on the basis that we don't think there is enough evidence to do that modelling to start trying to find a way to quantify how innovation is actually resulting in efficiency. Now, we do have to say it's not always going to be cash efficiency. And one of our difficulties, and it comes back to the point we've been discussing, is those efficiencies, where they are cash efficiencies, may not arise within the body in which that person's employed. So we then come back to the issue of how do we take account of efficiencies through the whole system, Annie's point again, rather than just saying this is an efficiency because the NHS has... For example, there's one case that we've been looking at in terms of child and adolescent mental health services in Fife, and a very interesting project that's been looking at reducing acute inpatient stays. And it's a programme that has been rolling out for some time and can demonstrate the sort of efficiencies that it has created, and also the improvements in service and outcomes for the people involved. But whether all those efficiencies are actually going to then arise in the NHS because the NHS has chosen to invest in that, we may not be able to, within our current budget framework, at local and national level, be able to account for that. And I think that is a flaw in the system that we've created. I guess all those around the table, members of the committee included, probably have local examples of fantastic work that's going on. The question for me is, how do we extrapolate that up into the way in which, if NHS boards come in to speak to you about how they're intending to spend their money, they can extrapolate that up into their part of that spend, which won't be everything. We can then extrapolate up into the decisions that are being made around levers to prevention within the Scottish budget. I don't think we have that line through the system at the moment, and nor do we have the line that runs across agencies. And that makes the question difficult.
Annie?
Navina, I don't know what the health boards are doing about this, but I'd come back to Audit Scotland's work on reshaping care, because I think there will be some interesting information in there for the committee with respect to the question you're asking. What I can say is that in our experience in the third sector, there are a number of organisations who can demonstrate their cost benefits and their outcomes until they're blue in the face. And does it actually make a lot of difference when it comes to purchasing decisions? The answer is not always. So there's two parts to this. There's actually demonstrating that you are able to deliver results and outcomes and efficiencies into the future. And then there's actually still making the case that that's something worth investing in. And that's where a lot of third sector organisations are still really, really struggling, because despite endless evidence up to and including peer-reviewed, published in journals about the outcomes that they can achieve, they're still getting huge pressure on costs. And either that, or else the dead hand of public procurement is applied to what they're doing, and the contract goes to somebody else who can do the activity for less money, but can't demonstrate the outcomes. And I think, the convener will know that I kind of bang on about this endlessly. But the connection between what we invest in and the demonstrable results that it will achieve is really not there. And that needs to be strengthened. And again, going back to joint strategic commissioning, I hope that evidence is kind of quite a strong point that people will consider when they're looking at what they're going to invest in for this agenda.
No, I think that's very helpful, Convener. I think it widens things, again, in terms of who is it that makes the spend and who is it that then, if you will, derives the benefit. And I worry that maybe the silo mentality that we've spoken about, that doesn't just exist within, for example, the health service, but exists between different agencies and different bodies, is, well, if we're going to be the ones spending the money up front, but we're not the ones who are going to see the benefit, we maybe need to look at whether there is a whole Scotland approach on the preventative spend agenda, and not just looking at it within individual services.
Well, again, to come back
I mean, I think that's what the revisions to the community planning process are supposed to be achieving. Because there you're not just talking about health and social care, you're also bringing in all the other things that people have mentioned around, you know, housing and education and early years and leisure and recreation and on, police, the whole lot. So that's the kind of forum, I think, where some of these decisions can be made. But I come back to my point about it's not just the money that needs to shrug off its label, it's some of the people around the table as well.
Rachel.
I just wanted to pick up on a point Annie was making about the Joint Strategic Commissioning and where that should allow some of these discussions to happen. I mean, I certainly hope that is the case, but it's a very new way of working in Scotland. We have a lot of development to do to get to where people who are around the table are going to feel confident in handling the sort of evidence and making evidence-based decisions on how to invest. And one of the things I think we maybe need to think about is, have we got enough investment going into the development of the frontline staff, the community groups, the third sector, whoever it is who needs to be around the table to get that right over the next couple of years, because the responsibility that we're going to put on those groups is going to be enormous in terms of investment decisions. And I think we do them a disservice if we don't make sure that the investment is there now in sufficient quantity.
Minette?
There's been some very interesting discussion this morning, I think, around health inequalities and also in keeping an ageing population out of acute services and crisis care. It strikes me that key to that is really promoting and also supporting self-responsibility in both avoiding long-term conditions and in managing them when they arise. And to do that, we've already heard, I think health visitors are very important in this, specialist nurses are important, GPs, HPs, all of whom seem to be in increasingly short supply to actually cope with what's required. Has any actual estimate been done of how many people need to be trained up in these particular areas of expertise, and has any estimate of what that might cost?
Rachel?
And one of the difficulties at the moment about coming up with firm figures, for example, on health visiting, and you'll be aware of the discussions that have been going on around that in the Children and Young People's Bill around the named person, is the quality of data that we're already working with. So, for example, within community nursing, the quality of data that we have on the community nursing workforce, the government has been very open, is not at this stage wholly accurate. So finding the baseline from which to then start projecting becomes difficult, and there is work ongoing when we're around the table with that to clean that data so that we are absolutely clear what the workforce is. But there's also something that's very important, and it comes back to, for me, the discussions around prioritisation is, I don't know that we're still 100% sure always of what it is that we're aiming at, and therefore how we staff it in the right ways, to come back to what Kim has been saying. We need to be absolutely sure of what we're training for. So we know that we're going to have an older population with multiple morbidities and complex needs. How are we going to bring the relevant groups around the table to plan for that? What is it that we want that service to look like? And I think we can give great examples of where things are working really well. It's how do we extrapolate that up into a national vision of what it is that we want? Because without that, the risk is we keep making the decisions on cost rather than on aspiration.
Donald Harley, then Kim.
Yeah, one of the sort of strange things, I suppose, is if you look over the last 20 years, the number of GPs has actually increased. But in the same time frame, the expectation of the public has outpaced that, and the things we're asking GPs to do have grown like topsy. So we talk about the preventive care. They're doing huge amounts of preventive care under the QOF framework and all the rest of it, which was never anticipated before the 2004 contract, and all of which are good thing. But it then has a knock-on constraint effect on the acute care side of things. So again, it's about deciding priorities. If there's a fixed pot of money, you can only do so much within that, and you have to make some hard choices, and that buck does come back to rest with the politicians ultimately. Or to pick up on your second question, what does more GPs or more workforce in that area look like? It's really difficult to say because the modelling is actually pretty poor around that, and there are some perverse incentives built into the system. But I think the starting point has to be, what is it you want, and how are you going to resource it?
That might be less GPs and more carers at home.
It might be. It's your choice.
I'm not being facetious, but I mean, I don't know whether it is our choice. I thought we were all agreed about creating a new workforce. Yeah. And the new workforce is, sometimes it's not a GP that people need, just a friend in need, or you know, the sense of well-being. I suppose that's the change. So you're definitely bought into a system that would shift the nature of the workforce, which would not necessarily mean increased GPs, maybe GPs with less of a workload, but that shifting to, you know, a more professionalised group, not even professionalised group, but more people dealing with individuals in the community. And I mean, I just look at the, you know, the GP, the focus we've got on GP and the people who are delivering the service. And it's all the news down south this week about the 15-minute visit. Where is the continuity and the quality, you know, in and around the GP, and we actually get to people who are delivering the service, sometimes on a 0 hour contract, on a minimum wage, and no time to take their coat off to provide the meal or a conversation. Is that not the contradiction we have here when we're dealing with budgets?
There's quite a few questions in there.
It was a bit of a rant, I know.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, it's almost motherhood and apple pie, isn't it? We all want a more effective, efficient service, whatever that looks like. If it delivers better care all round. Annette mentioned in her question about GPs, so I answered on GPs. It's certainly true that the solution will involve a mix of staff and resources, but nevertheless, I'll bring you back to a point I made earlier. Much more is being asked and expected of GPs. So there is clearly a demand there from the public and from politicians, and you have to decide what you want.
Annie, Kim, Matt, Rachel.
Convener, I wanted to agree with your rant, basically, because I think you're absolutely right that this isn't about more and more professionalisation, this is about less and less, and Nanette's question was about self-management and resilience and community support, and how do you maximise some of that? And the question for this committee is how does the budget drive some of that behaviour? And I come back to the points that my colleague Martin Syme was making when he was here before about how the third sector is absolutely pivotal to that, because if things are going to keep people out of hospital, it's going to be the neighbourhood network, the Garden Angels project, it's going to be those kinds of lunch clubs, you name it, really kind of localised self-help community supports, which really don't cost very much, but the kind of savings, which is what the member opposite was talking about, the investment in those kinds of projects and the savings that they then reap for the more acute services down the line, they're absolutely key. So what we'd like to see more of in here is some guarantees for a voice and a representation for the third sector in making some of those decisions, because I think, you know, notwithstanding the discussion we had about bums on seats and power struggles and all the rest of it, you know, if the same people are around the table, we cannot expect them to make any different decisions than they've ever made before. So we need a rogue element, I would suggest, put into some of these decision-making processes by people who actually have an agenda to drive here.
Kim, and then Rachel.
I can't agree more that it's down to what Mark was talking about, the modelling and making sure that we do absolutely need to. It could mean a change in. it doesn't necessarily, I agree with your rant, I suppose, is as well, that we're, so, but it's down to an evidence-based modelling on what's actually going to deliver the self-management that we're looking at. And just to, and it's a pity when, or rather I'm sitting here representing a group of people and want to obviously say, like others, what it is we bring to that piece. And I suppose we're mirroring what we would hope would go around a modelling table, not with anyone thinking anyone's more or less important, but that they're all part of the mix in order to deliver the outcome. And you know, that third sector organisations are absolutely crucial. Third sector organisations receive a lot of training from the statutory sectors, not least HPs do quite a lot of training, I know, for our colleagues working in the third sector. So you can't have one or the other. It's not a competition, but it's the sort of modelling, and you might come out with a very different looking workforce. And the point is, it shouldn't be, you know, it shouldn't be what's important to that particular workforce. Is it delivering the outcome? And comes back to Malcolm's point about it being linked to targets and indicators. What's actually making a difference, and getting the modelling right and getting the intelligence around that modelling right is absolutely crucial to making the shift, really.
I know the director of the RCN in Scotland has been out a lot talking to newly qualified nurses and students, and one of the key messages that she is saying to them at the moment is, don't expect your career to look like mine. It just won't. Nursing careers are going to look really different in the future. People will be working in different ways and for different people. And I mean, I would absolutely agree with Annie if what we want to do is stop people becoming socially isolated in older age and falling into the need for public sector care, then actually what we do need is community transport to get them to an appointment or to get them to the shops, to have people to speak to every single day. And I think for me the question, and it almost comes back to the round table we had a couple of weeks ago here on integration, where my point kept being, we need to understand why people are around the table if they're going to have a seat. And for me it's no different in this, that there should be a panoply of available resources as people's needs change and ebb and flow. And from our point of view, there is something specific that nursing brings to that, and that is our specific contribution, in the same way as there will be for doctors, in the same way as there is for a volunteer community transport driver in somebody's local community. It's knowing that we have the range so that people can pick up on what they need when they need it, and absolutely in terms of self-management, we would support that. I think a lot of the availability of IT supports is really crucial to that, to allow people to live the most independent life they possibly can with whatever their condition is, knowing that they have the support of an expert on the end of the phone if they need it, but not having to have that expert crowding their every moment. We have to move down that line, otherwise the system will creak.
Matt?
I mean, Chair, I suppose your rant, as you've described it, kind of shines a light in the elephant in the room. You know, that is the big issue. In some sense, you know, it is a credit to successive Scottish governments who haven't just said, well, look, let's do something different, stop the bus, scrap everything we've ever done before, and start with a clean sheet of paper. You know, we know we can't do that. We need to get there through a kind of incremental stage progression. I suppose the frustration we all share is that staged journey is ponderously slow, and there seem to be some real taboos around it, you know, in terms of issues people want to tackle. I think one of the fundamental issues actually lies with this kind of notion that. And thankfully it's not necessarily a Scottish notion, but a notion that you can kind of just create a big society and it will happen and it will be free. You know, I think we're a bit smarter than that here. But I do think that we need to recognise, picking up points many of the colleagues have made, that if you design a service based on cost, you will get a service delivered on cost, and that's not necessarily going to drive a quality service. And so I think if we're dead keen on tackling the health inequality agenda, and if we're dead keen on giving proper resources to public sector bodies and colleagues in the voluntary sector, and indeed potentially colleagues in the private sector who might be able to provide particular services, then we need to do that based on quality and based on real cost. And that needs to start to be based around recognising that 15-minute visits are not acceptable in Scotland. And that as a consequence of that, you know, paying somebody the minimum wage to do a 15-minute visit and no get paid between the visits is not acceptable in Scotland. And I think if we start from that premise as we devise these new services, then we will start to tackle the health inequalities agenda in totality. Because we can't ask people to, you know, deliver a service either from an organisational point of view or from the workforce at the front line point of view with their hands financially tied behind their back. We need to be fair and open and reasonable and honest if we want fair and open and reasonable, honest services for the people that we're providing them for.
Nate.
That's been a further interesting discussion. Thank you.
Rhoda, I see your hand.
It was just an illustration of where you were going, but that's fine.
Okay. Is there any other question for committee members? Once again, to you all, we appreciate all of the time you've given us, the written evidence, and we will take it on board, and we'll probably find ourselves around a similar table in the near future. But thank you all very much for your attendance here this morning, the evidence provided. Thank you. Suspend at this point. Yep.